The west coast of Africa, in the early 17th century, was a coastline being consumed, not quickly, not all at once, but with the slow grinding, systematic efficiency of a colonial project that had been building for more than a century. That had begun with Portuguese ships probing southward along the African coast in the 1400s, had accelerated through the establishment of trading posts, and then forts and then permanent settlements, and had produced, by the early 1600s, a colonial presence in the territory the Portuguese called Angola that was reshaping the political, economic, and human landscape of Central Western Africa in ways whose full consequences were still unfolding and would continue to unfold for the next 2 centuries. The territory in question was not empty. It was not ungoverned. It was not, by any honest accounting, the wilderness that the colonial ideology of the period needed it to be in order to justify what was being done to it. The people of the region, the Mbandu, speaking peoples of the central Angolan plateau, the Ndongo and the Matamba, inhabited a world of sophisticated political organization, of kingdoms and chiefdoms with histories that went back generations, with governance structures and economic systems and military capabilities that the Portuguese, when they first encountered them, had been compelled by the practical evidence to take seriously even when the ideological frameworks of their civilization told them not to. The Kingdom of Ndongo was, at the beginning of the 17th century, the political entity at the center of the story that was about to unfold. It was a Mbandu-speaking kingdom of the central Angolan interior, a state that had been navigating the Portuguese presence on its western border for decades, that had developed, through that navigation, a complex and constantly renegotiated relationship with the colonial power that combined trade and diplomacy and occasional military confrontation in the specific way of neighboring powers whose interests overlapped without being identical. The Ndongo had something the Portuguese wanted with an intensity that overrode every other consideration in their colonial calculation. Access to the interior, and specifically access to the human beings of the interior who could be captured, transported to the coast, loaded onto ships, and sold in the markets of Brazil and the Caribbean as enslaved labor. The Atlantic slave trade was, by the early 17th century, the economic engine driving the Portuguese colonial project in Angola with a force that was reshaping everything it touched. The numbers, in this period, were becoming enormous, tens of thousands of people per year, moving from the African interior to the coast, from the coast to the ships, from the ships to the Americas, from the Americas to the plantations and mines, whose products were generating the wealth that was financing the European colonial project's continued expansion. The human cost was, by any measure, catastrophic, not only in the immediate destruction of the individuals enslaved, but in the second effects that the trade produced in the African interior. The wars fought to capture enslaved people, the political destabilization of kingdoms, whose governance was warped by the trade's demands, the demographic devastation of populations whose young men and women were being systematically removed. The Portuguese presence at Luanda, the coastal settlement that had been established in 1575, and that was developing, by the early 17th century, into the administrative and commercial center of Portuguese Angola, was the visible expression of this project. From Luanda, Portuguese governors dispatched pombeiros, African and mixed-race traders who penetrated the interior, establishing the commercial relationships that connected the slave trade's supply chain in the interior to its export infrastructure on the coast. From Luanda, Portuguese military forces moved eastward in the Guerra Preta, the Black Wars, conducted with African auxiliary soldiers who did the majority of the fighting, while European commanders directed the strategy, pushing the boundaries of Portuguese territorial control deeper into the interior with each campaign. And from Luanda, Portuguese diplomats and missionaries worked to establish political relationships with African rulers that would, ideally, convert them from independent sovereigns into client kings whose authority served Portuguese purposes, rather than their own people's interests. The Kingdom of Ndongo had been resisting this pressure for decades. The Ngola Mbandi king, from whose title the entire territory eventually took its Portuguese name Angola, had fought Portuguese expansion, negotiated with it, accommodated it when accommodation was unavoidable, and resisted it when resistance was possible. The relationship was not simple. There were Ndongo elites who found in the Portuguese connection opportunities for personal advancement, access to trade goods, to weapons, to the political leverage that a European alliance could provide in the complex politics of the African interior. And there were Ndongo elites who understood, with a clarity that the immediate opportunities of collaboration made it easy to avoid, that the direction of the Portuguese project was the absorption of Ndongo's sovereignty into Portuguese colonial administration, and that no amount of diplomatic accommodation was going to change that direction. The Portuguese, by the second decade of the 17th century, were moving against Ndongo with a military force and a political determination that made the previous decades of negotiated coexistence look, in retrospect, like a preparation rather than a stable arrangement. Governor Luís Mendes de Vasconcelos, appointed in 1617, was not a diplomat. He was a soldier who had been sent to Angola with a mandate to expand Portuguese territorial control, to break the Ndongo kingdom's independence, and to open the slave trade routes of the interior to Portuguese commercial exploitation. He conducted campaigns against Ndongo with a ferocity that the previous governor's approaches had not matched. He drove the Ndongo Ngola Mbandi, who had recently come to power, through the violent elimination of his predecessor, from the capital and into retreat across the Kwanza to an in refuge of King Ndonga. Ndongo was in crisis. Its king was in exile. Its political coherence was under assault. Its people were being captured in their tens of thousands, and fed into the Atlantic slave trade's insatiable machinery. The kingdom that had maintained its independence against Portuguese pressure for generations was, by the early 1620s, looking at the possibility that the independence it had defended might be ending. And then, in 1621, the Ngola sent an embassy to Luanda. The embassy was not a surrender. It was a negotiation. And the person the Ngola chose to lead it was not one of his senior male advisors, not a military commander, not a figure whose credentials derived from the conventional sources of Ndongo political authority. He sent his sister. Her name was Nzinga. And the Portuguese, who had been operating in Africa for a century and a half, had never encountered anyone quite like her. She was born into power and into peril simultaneously, which, in the Ndongo of the late 16th century, was the condition of everyone who stood close to the throne. The year of her birth is estimated at approximately 1583. The place was the Kingdom of Ndongo, in the central Angolan plateau, a landscape of savanna and forest, of rivers that ran from the highland interior toward the Atlantic coast, of a political world organized around the Sobas, the regional lords whose allegiance constituted the Ngola's kingdom, and whose shifting loyalties were the constant preoccupation of the royal house at Kabasa. Her father was Ngola Kiakasenda, a king of Ndongo whose reign was defined by the accelerating Portuguese pressure on his kingdom's western border and by the internal political tensions that the slave trade was generating within Ndongo society. He was a man navigating a world that was being reorganized by forces he could partially understand and partially resist, whose decisions about whether to accommodate the Portuguese or confront them shaped the lives of everyone in his kingdom, and whose legacy, the political situation he left his successors, would determine whether Ndongo survived as an independent state or was absorbed into Portuguese Angola. Nzinga was not his firstborn son. She was not the designated heir. She was, by the formal calculations of Ndongo's succession, a princess whose political significance was secondary to that of her brothers, particularly the brother who would eventually become Imbroda, and who would send her to Luanda as his ambassador. But the formal calculations of succession are not the only calculations that matter in the formation of a political figure, and what the accounts of Nzinga's life consistently reveal is that she was, from childhood, a person who absorbed the education available to royal children with an intensity and a comprehensiveness that formal succession calculations did not require of her, but that her own intelligence demanded. She learned the political traditions of the Ndongo court. She learned the governance structures through which the Ngola exercised authority, the system of sobas and regional lords, the networks of tribute and obligation that connected the kingdom's periphery to its center, the ceremonial and symbolic dimensions of royal authority that were not merely decorative but functional expressions of the power relationships that held the kingdom together. She absorbed the military culture of a kingdom that had been intermittingly at war with the Portuguese, and, with neighboring African polities, throughout her childhood, developing an understanding of how military force and political negotiation interacted that would, in the decades to come, define her strategic approach. She also learned, from observation of her father's court, and the Portuguese presence on its borders, something more specific and more immediately relevant to the situation she would eventually inherit. How the Portuguese operated. She watched the Pombeiros who moved through the kingdom's trade networks. She observed the missionaries whose presence in Ndongo had been negotiated as part of the complex accommodation with Portuguese power. She watched how the Portuguese combined commercial pressure with diplomatic manipulation with military threat, shifting between these instruments as circumstances required, always with the underlying goal of expanding their access to the kingdom's human resources for the slave trade. She was learning her enemy. She was doing it carefully. She was doing it years before she would be required to engage that enemy directly. The court of her father was also a school in the specific dangers of proximity to power in a world where succession disputes were resolved by violence. Ndongo court politics were not gentle. The transitions between kings were frequently bloody, marked by the elimination of potential rivals, by the factional conflicts of the Sobas whose allegiances determined which claimant could secure the throne, by the particular ruthlessness of a political system in which the stakes of succession were absolute. Nzinga grew up watching this. She grew up understanding that the royal court was a place of genuine physical danger as well as political opportunity. That the same proximity to the Angola that gave her influence also made her a potential target of those who saw her as a threat or as a resource to be controlled. Her relationship with her father was, by the accounts, one of particular closeness and particular formative influence. He taught her directly, not merely the symbolic dimensions of royal authority but its practical exercise. He took her to military councils. He involved her in the discussions of state that formal convention might have excluded her from. Whether this reflected an assessment of her specific capabilities, a political calculation about the uses of a daughter with exceptional intelligence, or simply the affection of a father, who found in this child a mind worth developing. Its effect was to give her an education in governance that most women of her era and position were not provided. The death of her father and the succession of her brother Ngola Mbandi introduced the darkness that the oral tradition and the historical record both preserve without softening. Mbandi's path to the throne was violent even by the standards of Ndongo succession, and the violence did not stop at the throne's competitors. The oral tradition, maintained across generations of Ndongo and Matamba descendants, preserves an account whose details have been debated but whose essential direction is not in question. That Mbandi, securing his position, had Nzinga's son killed, and that he had Nzinga herself subjected to a procedure, forcible sterilization in some accounts, intended to ensure that she could not produce heirs who might become future threats to his line. The accounts differ in their specifics. What they agree on is the fact of Mbandi's violence toward his own family, and the fact of Nzinga's survival of it. Survival not merely physical but psychological and political. She did not collapse, she did not submit. She did not become the diminished, domesticated, politically neutralized figure that Mbandi's actions were apparently designed to produce. She absorbed what had been done to her with the same quality that her childhood had built. The capacity to transform injury into fuel, to take what the world offered as a reason for submission and convert it into a reason for something else entirely. She was, by the time her brother chose her as his ambassador to the Portuguese in 1621, a woman in her late 30s, who had survived the specific education of a royal court in crisis, who had watched her kingdom bleed under Portuguese pressure, who had experienced personal violence at the hands of the brother she was being sent to represent, and who understood, with the clarity of someone who had been studying this problem for her entire adult life, exactly what the Portuguese wanted, exactly what they were willing to give, and exactly what the gap between those two positions was. She rode to Luanda. She rode knowing what she was walking into. She rode with the preparation of a person who had been getting ready for this moment for 30 years. The Portuguese governor was waiting for her. He would not be ready. The meeting in Luanda in 1621 is one of the most celebrated moments in the history of African resistance to European colonialism. celebrated not for military victory, but for something rarer and in its way more remarkable. A diplomatic confrontation, in which an African ruler's representative walked into the administrative center of a European colonial power, and, through a combination of intelligence, psychological acuity, and absolute refusal to accept the terms of subordination that the colonial protocol was designed to impose, walked out with an agreement that served her kingdom's interests. The details of the encounter have been elaborated by tradition and by the imagination of subsequent generations who understood its meaning. But the core of what happened is established well enough by the Portuguese accounts themselves. Accounts written by people who had no particular interest in making the African woman look better than she was. Governor João Correia de Sousa, Vasconcelos's successor, received Nzinga in the formal setting of his Luanda headquarters. The setting was designed to communicate, through its physical arrangements, the hierarchy of the encounter. The governor seated on air, elevated, in the posture of authority, a visiting ambassador without a chair, standing in the posture of a petitioner. It was a protocol whose meaning was clear and deliberate, a physical staging of the colonial relationship, in which the Portuguese governor was the sovereign and the African representative was the supplicant. Nzinga looked at the arrangement. She looked at her attendants. She directed one of them to kneel on the floor. She sat on the attendant's back. The gesture was not merely theatrical. It was a precise, instantaneous, completely legible political statement. She had not come to Luanda as a petitioner. She had come as a sovereign. She would not stand while the governor sat. She would not accept the physical staging of subordination. And she had the intelligence and the composure to make this statement not through confrontation, not through refusing the meeting or demanding different furniture, but through a creative improvisation that communicated in proposition, while maintaining the diplomatic form that the meeting required. The governor understood what she had done. The accounts suggest he was sufficiently impressed to engage with her as something closer to an equal than the staging had intended. The negotiations that followed were substantive. Nzinga negotiated on behalf of her brother with the full range of a political intelligence she had spent her life developing, pressing for the withdrawal of Portuguese forces from Ndongo territory, for limitations on the slaves' penetration of the kingdom, for the recognition of Ndongo sovereignty that the Portuguese advance had been eroding. She negotiated also for herself, agreeing to receive Christian baptism as part of the diplomatic package, taking the Portuguese name Dona Ana de Sousa, accepting Governor Correia de Sousa as her godfather in a ceremony whose religious dimension she managed with the same pragmatic intelligence she brought to the secular negotiations. The baptism was not a conversion in the spiritual sense that the Portuguese missionaries intended. It was a diplomatic instrument, a gesture that gave the Portuguese what their religious ideology required to want from their African interlocutors, while giving Nzinga access to the political relationship with the colonial power that the gesture enabled. She understood the transactional nature of the religious ceremony, with the clarity of a person who had been watching the Portuguese operate for 30 years, and who knew precisely which of their demands were expressions of genuine strategic interest and which were expressions of ideological need that could be satisfied symbolically without substantive concession. The treaty she negotiated, the Treaty of Luanda, agreed in 1622, contained provisions that served the Ndongo's immediate interests. A Portuguese military withdrawal from occupied Ndongo territory, the return of captives taken in recent campaigns, limitations on Portuguese interference in Ndongo internal affairs. It was not a perfect agreement. The Portuguese had their own interpretation of its terms, and the history of the years following the treaty was a history of Portuguese violations of its provisions, and Nzinga could not prevent from Cabasa. But the fact of the treaty, the fact that an African kingdom had sent a representative to the colony capital, and returned with a written agreement acknowledging Ndongo's sovereignty, and placing limitations on Portuguese action, was itself a diplomatic achievement of the first order. But the treaty was already beyond the mind before the ink had dried. Portuguese governors changed. The commitment of one governor was not binding on his successor. And the underlying direction of Portuguese colonial policy, the expansion of slave trade access, the extension of territorial control, the reduction of independent African kingdoms to Pleiad status, was not changed by a single treaty, however skillfully negotiated. The Portuguese continued to press. The Ndongo continued to resist, and Nzinga back in Kabasa was watching her brother fail to hold what she had negotiated on his behalf. Mbandi was not Nzinga. He did not have her political intelligence, her diplomatic skill, her psychological toughness, or her understanding of the Portuguese. He had sent her to Luanda because he needed her capabilities. He had mutilated her children because he feared her capabilities. The contradiction between those two facts, needing what she had while being terrified of what she was, defined their relationship and, increasingly, defined the crisis of Ndongo's governance. The Portuguese pressure resumed. The military campaigns continued. The slave trade continued to drain the kingdom's population. And Mbandi, caught between the Portuguese advance from the west and the internal political pressures of a kingdom in crisis, descended into a paralysis that the oral tradition and the historical record describe with a consistency that suggests genuine historical foundation. In 1624, Ngola Mbandi died. The circumstances of his death have been debated since the 17th century. The oral tradition preserved by Nzinga's descendants and the Ndongo historical memory attributes his death to suicide. A king who had reached the limits of what he could endure. Other accounts suggest something more deliberate. Whether Nzinga played an active role in her brother's death, as her enemies claimed, and as the political logic of the situation might suggest, or whether she simply moved, with the speed and decision of a person who had been waiting for this moment, to claim the regency for her nephew, and then the throne itself when the regency proved untenable, the result was the same. In 1624, Nzinga became the ruler of Ndongo, the woman whose son had been killed by her brother's order. The woman who had been sent to negotiate, and had negotiated brilliantly and had been ignored. The woman who had sat on her attendant's back in the governor's hall of Luanda and declared, without words, that she was nobody's supplicant. She was queen now, and she had a great deal of work to do. The political situation Ndai inherited when she took the Ndongo throne in 1624 was, by any objective assessment, desperate. The Portuguese were not honoring the Treaty of Luanda. Their military forces continued to operate in Ndongo territory. Their Pomberos and African allies continued to raid for enslaved people. The Sobas, the regional lords, whose allegiance constituted the kingdom's political structure, were under continuous pressure from the Portuguese to transfer their loyalty. Through a system of tribute and protection that was essentially a colonial clientage network, from the Angola to the Portuguese colonial administration. Some had already made that transfer. Others were wavering. The coherence of the Ndongo political structure was eroding not only through military pressure, but through the patient, systematic work of Portuguese political subversion. And Nzinga's claim to the throne was not uncontested. The Portuguese, who had their own candidate for the Ndongo Angola, a figure more amenable to their interests, who would govern Ndongo as a client rather than an independent ruler, refused to recognize her as the legitimate sovereign. They argued, using the formal language of Ndongo succession convention, that the throne could not pass to a woman. The argument was politically convenient and historically inconsistent. Ndongo political tradition was more complex on the question of female rule than the Portuguese representation of it suggested. But it served the colonial purpose of delegitimizing a ruler who could not be controlled. Nzinga did not wait for the legitimacy debate to be resolved in her favor. She acted. Her first strategic moves reflected the full range of political intelligence she had been developing for 4 decades. She understood that Ndongo, in its current state, could not resist the Portuguese through conventional military confrontation. That the kingdom lacked the military force to defeat Portuguese armies in the field. That the fortified positions the Portuguese had established on Ndongo territory gave them operational advantages that Ndongo's forces could not easily overcome. She understood that the political subversion of the Sobas was as dangerous as the military campaigns. That a kingdom whose regional lords had transferred their loyalty to the Portuguese was a kingdom that could not sustain any resistance, regardless of the quality of its military leadership. She needed allies. She needed military capability that Ndongo alone could not provide. And she needed a political strategy that addressed the Portuguese colonial project at its structural foundations, rather than simply responding to its military manifestations. The alliance she sought and found was with the Mbangala. The bands of warrior fighters who moved through the central Angolan interior as organized military forces, outside the conventional political structures of the region. The Mbangala were, in the political economy of the 17th century Angolan interior, a complex and morally ambiguous phenomenon. Highly effective fighters who had been used by both the Portuguese and various African kingdoms as military auxiliaries, whose social organization and military practices were outside the mainstream of Mbandu cultural tradition, and whose alliance was available to whoever could offer the combination of military partnership and political legitimacy that they sought. Nzinga offered both. She integrated herself into Mbangala military culture with a completeness that shocked contemporary observers. Portuguese accounts describe her adopting Mbangala dress and practices, taking on the Jenga, fluid ceremonial role of the Ganga, leading her forces in the field with the physical presence of a warrior commander, rather than directing from the safety of a protected position. Whether these accounts are precisely accurate in their details, or elaborated by the hostile intent of their Portuguese authors, the direction they describe is consistent with what the subsequent record shows. Nzinga built an Mbangala, allied military force that was qualitatively different from the conventional Ndongo army, more mobile, more aggressive, more capable of the kind of sustained guerrilla campaign that the Angolan interior's terrain supported. She also pursued a diplomatic strategy of considerable sophistication. She maintained communication with European powers, the Dutch, specifically, who were challenging Portuguese commercial dominance in the Atlantic world, and whose interest in disrupting Portuguese, Angola's slave trade infrastructure, created the basis for a potential alliance. The Dutch West India Company had been expanding its presence in the Atlantic world throughout the 1620s and 1630s, and its interest in Angola, in the possibility of breaking Portuguese control of the slave trade routes and substituting Dutch commercial dominance, gave Nzinga a potential partner whose military capability was of a different order than anything she could find among African allies alone. The Portuguese, meanwhile, were pressing. Their refusal to recognize Nzinga as legitimate Ngola, combined with continued military operations against Ndongo, forced her into a strategic retreat that the historical record describes with a precision that reflects the Portuguese military's careful documentation of their campaigns. In 1626, Portuguese forces drove Nzinga from Ndongo territory itself, capturing the Kindonga island refuge where she had established herself, forcing her eastward into the territory that would eventually become the basis of a new kingdom. But retreat, for Nzinga, was a tactical adjustment rather than a surrender. She moved eastward, she built. She maintained her forces. She kept the political networks alive. The communications with the Sobas who had not fully committed to the Portuguese, with the Mbangala bands, who remained available for alliance, with the Dutch who were developing their own Angolan ambitions. She governed in exile with the organizational discipline of a person who understood that the capacity to wait, to rebuild, and to act at the right moment was as important as any simple military victory. And then, in 1630, she moved against the neighboring kingdom of Matamba, the Mbandu, speaking kingdom to the northeast of Ndongo, whose queen she overthrew, and whose territory she seized to establish the base of operations she needed. The capture of Matamba was not merely a territorial acquisition. It was a political transformation. Nzinga was no longer the exiled Angola of a conquered kingdom, dependent on the goodwill of the Mbangala bands who hosted her forces. She was the queen of Matamba, a sovereign with a territory, a capital, a population, and the institutional basis for the kind of sustained resistance to Portuguese expansion that the previous decade had not given her the infrastructure to mount. She was 50 years old. She had been fighting the Portuguese, directly and indirectly, for most of her adult life. She had lost her son, her kingdom, and her home country. She had survived assassination, conquest and exile. She was not finished. She was just getting organized. Matamba under Nzinga's rule became something that the Portuguese colonial project in Angola had not previously encountered in its century and a half of Angolan operations, an organized, stable, strategically sophisticated African state that was explicitly and permanently committed to resisting Portuguese expansion and that possessed the military capability, the diplomatic reach, and the political coherence to make that commitment effective. The kingdom she built at Matamba was not a simple military camp. It was a state, with the governance structures, the economic organization, and the diplomatic apparatus that the term implies. She had spent her years of exile and campaigning doing more than fighting. She had been studying governance, learning what the Mbangala military system could provide and what it could not, learning what a sustainable kingdom required in terms of economic base and political legitimacy and the integration of diverse populations into a coherent political community. The Matamba she constructed applied those lessons with the thoroughness of a ruler who understood that military victory without political consolidation was temporary. The economic foundation of Matamba's power was, inevitably, connected to the slave trade, the same trade that had been devastating Ndongo and the broader Angolan interior. This is the most morally complex dimension of Nzinga's story, the dimension that the celebratory narrative sometimes elides, but that historical honesty requires acknowledging. Matamba's position in the central Angolan interior placed it astride the attendant trades that connected the interior slave raiding networks to the Portuguese coastal export infrastructure. Nzinga engaged with this trade, not as a passive victim but as an active participant, taxing the trade routes that ran through her territory, controlling access to the interior markets, using the economic resources generated by participation in the trade to fund the military and political apparatus of her resistance to Portuguese territorial expansion. The moral calculus is not comfortable. The woman who was simultaneously the most effective resistor of Portugal expansion in the Angolan interior and a participant in the trade in enslaved people that was the engine of that expansion. This person cannot be reduced to simple heroism without dishonesty. What Nzinga represents is the full, terrible complexity of historical agency in a world organized by forces that no individual actor fully controlled. A woman of extraordinary capability operating within a system whose terms she could partially resist and partially redirect, but could not escape or abolish. What she could control was the Portuguese advance. And she controlled it with a military and diplomatic sophistication that produced, by the late 1630s and early 1640s, a strategic situation that the Portuguese colonial administration in Luanda had not anticipated, and could not easily resolve. Her military system, built on the Mbangala foundation, and supplemented with the forces Matamba's own population could provide, was organized for the specific conditions of the Angolan interior, for the kind of mobile, decentralized warfare that the savanna and forest terrain supported, for the hit and run operations against Portuguese supply lines and allied sobas that could not be countered by the conventional European military tactics that the Guerra Preta relied on, for the sustained campaign across a wide geographic area that wore down an opponent's resources and will without requiring the decisive set piece engagement that a numerically smaller force could not win. She did not fight the Portuguese in the open field if she could avoid it. She made the territory itself her weapon, using the interior's distances, its lack of Portuguese accessible supply infrastructure, and her own forces' superior knowledge of the terrain to maintain a pressure that the Portuguese could not simply extinguish. The diplomatic opportunity she had been cultivating since the 16th materialized in 1641. The Dutch West India Company, pursuing its broader strategy of Atlantic commercial expansion at Portuguese expense, captured Luanda, the Portuguese colonial capital, the administrative heart of the Angolan slave trade system, in a naval assault that the Portuguese garrison could not resist. The Dutch seizure of Luanda was not, from the Dutch perspective, primarily about Angolan liberation. It was about commercial dominance, about substituting Dutch control of the slave trade routes for Portuguese control. But from Nzinga's perspective, the Dutch arrival in Luanda was the military partner she had been working toward for 2 decades, a European power with naval superiority over the Portuguese, with land forces that could operate in the Angolan coastal zone, and with an interest in African alliances that could extend Dutch commercial reach into the interior. She moved immediately. She sent ambassadors to the Dutch at Luanda. She offered military cooperation against the Portuguese, her forces in the interior coordinating with Dutch forces on the coast, to squeeze the Portuguese from both directions simultaneously, cutting off their supply lines, destroying their African allies, eliminating the Portuguese military presence in Angola, in the combined operation that neither side could accomplish alone. The Dutch-Nzinga alliance was not a relationship of equals. The Dutch brought their own commercial interests to the partnership and their own assumptions about the role of African allies in European colonial conflicts. But for Nzinga it was the strategic leverage she needed. A way to convert her interior military capability into pressure on the coastal Portuguese infrastructure that had been sustaining the colonial project's advance. The campaigns of the early 1640s were the most militarily ambitious of her career. She coordinated with Dutch forces in operations that drove Portuguese military power back from positions it had held for years. She recaptured Ndongo territory, the homeland she had been driven from in 1626, and established Nzinga do Golongo as a forward military position. She brought Sobas, who had been operating as Portuguese client, into the Matamba, Ndongo political orbit, through a combination of military pressure and the political legitimacy that her successful campaigns were generating. She was in her late 50s and early 60s, conducting the most geographically extensive and militarily sophisticated campaign of her career, had already included extraordinary episodes. She was governing simultaneously. She was managing the complex politics of Matamba, the integration of Mbangala forces whose military culture was not identical to Mbandu tradition, the governance of a population diverse in origin and in relationship to the state, the maintenance of the trade networks that sustained the kingdom's economic foundation. She was receiving diplomatic missions from the Portuguese, who were attempting to negotiate a peace that would stop the Dutch, aligned military pressure from the Dutch, whose commercial interests in the alliance were developing in directions that did not always align with Nzinga's, from neighboring African rulers whose relationship with Matamba was being continuously renegotiated as Matamba's power grew. She was doing all of this as a woman in a world whose political conventions assumed that rulers were men, navigating the gender politics of authority with the same creative pragmatism she had brought to the chair in the governor's hall of Luanda. She dressed in the regalia of kingship rather than the dress of a queen consort. She took female concubines dressed as men, an arrangement that the accounts describe with the specific confusion of Portuguese observers whose frameworks did not accommodate what they were seeing. She performed the ceremonial roles of the Ngola, the male royal, with a completeness that went beyond symbolic appropriation into a sustained performance of royal identity that redefined, for the people she governed, what the category of sovereign included. At her peak, in the mid-1640s, Nzinga governed the most powerful African state in the central Angolan interior, a kingdom that the Portuguese could not defeat, that the Dutch respected as a military partner, and that the Sobas of the region recognized as the primary African political authority in a landscape that Portuguese colonial advance had been reorganizing for a century. She was 60 years old. She had survived everything her world had thrown at her. And the most complex phase of her reign was still ahead. The Dutch alliance collapsed. It collapsed not through Nzinga's failure, but through the broader dynamics of European colonial competition that had made the alliance possible in the first place, and that now, when those dynamics shifted, made it unavailable. In 1648, a Portuguese fleet arrived at Luanda carrying forces from Brazil, a military intervention that the Dutch garrison, stretched thin across an Atlantic commercial empire, with more theaters than it could adequately defend, could not resist. The Portuguese recaptured Luanda. The Dutch withdrew. The strategic foundation of the alliance that had been the basis of Azim's most ambitious military campaigns evaporated in the time it took a fleet to cross the South Atlantic. The loss of the Dutch alliance was the most significant strategic setback of Nzinga's career. It was not only the loss of a military partner. It was the loss of the leverage that the Dutch alliance had provided. The ability to threaten the Portuguese coastal infrastructure from a direction that Nzinga's interior forces alone could not reach. Without Dutch naval power at Luanda, without Dutch land forces coordinating with her interior operations, the Portuguese colonial administration could concentrate its military resources against Matamba without the distraction of the coastal threat. The operational balance that had sustained her campaigns of the early 1640s was gone. The Portuguese moved. Governor Salvador Correa des, who had led the reconquest of Luanda from the Dutch, was not a man inclined toward accommodation. He launched a sustained military campaign against Nzinga's forces in the interior, that pressing eastward with the combined force of Portuguese regulars and the African allies, who had remained within the Portuguese client network throughout the years of Dutch presence. The campaigns of 1648-1650 were the hardest of Nzinga's military career, conducted against a Portuguese force that was larger, better supplied, and no longer distracted by the Dutch threat, fighting for the survival of Matamba as an independent state, rather than for the expansion she had been pursuing in the alliance years. She adapted. The same tactical intelligence that had built the alliance strategy now built a defensive strategy, retreating deeper into the interior when confronted with Portuguese force, making the terrain work, as it had always worked for her. Maintaining the organizational coherence of her forces through the kind of mobile warfare that the Portuguese could pursue, but could not sustain at the distances and logistics costs of the deep interior. She was not winning. She was not losing. She was making the Portuguese campaign expensive enough, and indefinite enough, that the calculation of its cost began to compete with demands on the Portuguese colonial administration's resources. The internal politics of Matamba complicated the military situation. The Mbangala commanders who had been the military backbone of her kingdom's forces were not subordinates in the straightforward sense. They were partners whose cooperation was based on mutual benefit, whose loyalty was real but not unconditional, and whose assessment of Matamba's military prospects affected their continued commitment. As the Portuguese campaigns of the late 1640s stretched into the early 1650s without the decisive victories that the alliance years had produced, the pressure on these relationships became visible. Some Mbangala commanders recalculated their positions. The political coherence that Nzinga had built at considerable cost over 20 years was under strain. The personal losses of this period were compounding. Her sister Kifunji, who had been captured by the Portuguese and held in Luanda for years as a hostage, a political prisoner whose confinement was a continuous pressure on Nzinga's diplomatic calculations, died in Portuguese custody in 1646. Nzinga's other sister, Mukambu, who had also been captured, and who had converted to Christianity in Portuguese custody, died later. The women who had been her closest companions, who had shared the years of exile and campaigning, who had been the personal anchors of a life lived in continuous political and military crisis, were gone. The Portuguese, sensing the cumulative pressure on Nzinga's position, offered negotiation. Governor Correia Dessa dispatched a Capuchin missionary, Father Antonio Romano, to Matamba to open discussions about a peace agreement. The offer was not generous. The Portuguese wanted Nzinga's acknowledgement of their sovereignty, the return of enslaved people held in Matamba, limitations on Matamba's military operations against Portuguese aligned Sobas, and a formal return to Christianity, the faith she had nominally adopted in 1622, and had long since set aside. Nzinga negotiated. She was 67 years old. She had been fighting the Portuguese for her entire adult life. She was fighting now from a position that was not as strong as it had been in the alliance years. She was not desperate. Matamba was still a functioning defended state, and the Portuguese campaigns had not broken her military capability. But she was calculating, with the pragmatic intelligence that had always defined her political thinking, what peace on acceptable terms could achieve that continued war could not. The negotiations were extended, complex, and conducted with the same combination of strategic clarity and tactical flexibility that had characterized her diplomacy since 1621. She pushed for the return of her sister Mukambu's remains, a demand that was personal and symbolic simultaneously, a statement about what she would and would not accept from the Portuguese. She pushed for recognition of Matamba's sovereignty and of her own legitimacy as its ruler. She pushed for limitations on Portuguese slave raiding in territory adjacent to Matamba. She also, in 1656, formally reconciled with the Catholic Church, accepting the Christian faith, taking the name Dona Ana de Sousa that she had first used in 1622. Receiving baptism in a ceremony that the Capuchin mission inscribed with the Traddist enthusiasm of men who believed they had achieved a genuine spiritual conversion, and that the historical record suggests was, as it had been in 1622, a diplomatic instrument of considerable sophistication. The peace of 1656 was by the standards of what was achievable, a reasonable outcome. Matamba retained its independence. Nzinga retained her throne. The Portuguese limitations on slave raiding in Matamba's sphere of influence were imperfect and incompletely enforced. But they were real constraints on the Portuguese advance. The recognition she had sought, The acknowledgement that Matamba was a sovereign state, and that she was its legitimate ruler, was embedded in the agreement's terms. She had fought the Portuguese for 35 years. She had won some and lost some. She had built a kingdom from exile, and maintained it against the most sustained, colonial military pressure in the region. She had outlasted governors and alliances and Dutch fleets and Imbangala complications and the deaths of her sisters and the loss of her homeland. She was still here. The years after the peace of 1656 were the strangest of Nzinga's life. The years in which the woman who had spent 4 decades in continuous political and military crisis found herself, for the first time since childhood, governing without an immediate existential threat to her kingdom's survival. She was in her early 70s. The physical toll of a life conducted in the field, of campaigns across the Angolan interior, of the specific hardships of a military existence, maintained through the most demanding decades of a long life, was visible and real. The accounts describe a woman whose body bore the evidence of what she had asked of it, still commanding in presence, still intellectually formidable, but carrying the weight of 7 decades that had contained more conflict and loss and consequence than most lives produce in their entirety. She turned, in these final years, with characteristic energy and characteristic pragmatism, to the governance of the kingdom she had secured. Matamba, under the peace, was a state with the opportunity to develop its internal capacities, rather than dedicating the majority of its resources to military survival. She attended to the Sobas whose loyalty constituted the kingdom's political structure, to the trade networks whose functioning sustained its economic life, to the diplomatic relationships with neighboring African states, and with the Portuguese and their Capuchin missionaries whose continued presence in Matamba was part of the peace's terms. The Capuchin missionaries became, in these final years, a complicated but genuine presence in her life. The accounts they left, and the Capuchins, unlike the earlier Portuguese observers, came with a different set of intentions, and produced a different quality of documentation. Describe a woman of extraordinary intelligence engaging with Christian theology and practice on her own terms, a bringing to the faith the same combination of genuine interest and pragmatic calculation that she brought to everything. Whether the late life Christianity was genuine conversion or the continuation of a diplomatic performance she had begun in 1622 is a question that the sources do not resolve definitively, and that perhaps cannot be resolved, because the distinction between genuine faith and strategic religious identity is not always meaningful in the lives of people for whom religion and politics are inseparable. She concerned herself, in these years, with the question of what Matamba would be after her, with succession in a kingdom that she had built around her own extraordinary personal capability, and that faced the challenge all such kingdoms face, the problem of institutional continuity in the absence of the founding personality. She had no children, the son killed by Mbandi's order, the sterilization that the oral tradition preserves. She made arrangements for succession that reflected her political intelligence, designating her sister Mukambu's daughter as heir, working to ensure the loyalty of the Sobas to the designated successor, building the institutional relationships that might sustain Matamba's independence after the personality that had created and defended it was gone. She also, in a gesture whose personal meaning is not fully recoverable, but whose symbolic weight is undeniable, arranged for the remains of her sister Kifonji, who had died in Portuguese custody decades earlier, to be returned to Matamba for proper burial. The return of Kifonji's bones was a matter of profound importance to Nzinga, maintained through years of negotiation as a condition of the broader diplomatic relationship with the Portuguese. When the remains finally arrived at Matamba, Nzinga received them with the ceremony that the dead deserved. The woman who had done so much in her life that was pragmatic and calculated, and strategically necessary gave this act, at the end of her life, the full weight of personal grief that a lifetime of political necessity had required her to defer. In December 1663, Nzinga died at Matamba. She was approximately 80 years old, an age that was extraordinary by the standards of the 17th century life and more extraordinary still for a life lived as hers had been, in the specific physical and psychological demands of 40 years of resistance to colonial power. She died in her kingdom, in her capital, as its reigning queen. Not in exile, not in Portuguese custody, Not as a conquered subject of the colonial administration, she had spent her life fighting. She died as she had insisted on living on her own terms, in her own place, under her own authority.